Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we have with us Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. We're going to talk about the miscreant activity of the CIA in South America. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we're hanging out with Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. I just want to remind everybody we got a lot to talk about today. As always, we're talking about what the CIA's up to. There we go. CIA adapted George Orwell's Animal Farm for political purposes in the Cold War. Lots of stuff at covertactionmagazine.com. All things CIA intelligence, all of that stuff. There we go. If the jackboot fits, Big Brother is still watching you. Lots of going on. Here's an interesting article. And I tell you why we're going to inculcate this article into our discussion. The Darien Gap, straddling Panama and Colombia, is a mass migrant graveyard that exemplifies the injustice of today's global economy. Let me tell you why that's a good article, and we're going to talk about that and more. As we discuss the issue of immigration, people who listen to my channel know I always take the position. You don't have a country if you don't have borders. You've got to have a country, and you must have control of your borders for numbers of reasons. However, what we don't discuss in America, what our political class doesn't discuss, is the fact that they've been rampaging in Central and South America for centuries now, overthrowing governments, installing dictators, doing everything they can to destabilize and rob the countries in Central and South America. Therefore, creating through violence, brutality, covert action, and of course, NAFTA and other trade so-called agreements, the environments where the people are impoverished and they end up, as a result of our own policy, showing up at our front door. Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov, thank you very much for coming back on a Friday morning.
It's great to be with you.
So let's get started. Venezuela, we could probably pick any country in Central and South America, but Venezuela in particular, since they're like, oh, we've got to save the people of Venezuela. Why are we always saving somebody? We're saving the Venezuelan people from the dictator Maduro, as the Venezuelan people all arm and get ready to defend their country. But no, we're saving them. Let's talk about a history of the CIA operations and the dirty dealings that have been done in Venezuela.
Sure. Well, I mean, you can go back. Once they discovered oil in Venezuela, the U.S. government took a keen interest in the country, and I've studied in some depth, some Cold War programs in the 1960s, Kennedy and Johnson administrations, the United States Agency of International Development, Office of Public Safety, which was training police forces in countries all around the world. In theory, it was supposed to be training them, to promote democratic police standards, but in practice, they were using those programs as cover for CIA covert operations to, train the secret police and use the police to fortify certain kinds of governments that the U.S. preferred. And Kennedy was more on the liberal end, so he wasn't going for the brute military dictators. There was a guy, Jimenez, in Venezuela, who he opposed, but he was supporting the center left. But I mean, the problem in Venezuela is that a lot of their oil industry at that time was owned by the Creole Petroleum Company, which is a branch of Rockefeller Standard Oil, and it was only the what you can call the hard left that wanted to nationalize the oil, like Chavez did in 1998, and use the resources to develop Venezuela's economy and introduce, a social program for the poor. The governments that Kennedy favored a guy named Romulo Betancourt, who was he was center left, but he refused to touch the Standard Oil empire and place Venezuelan oil under control. So there was a more left-wing movement led by figures who I think Chavez admired, like Douglas Bravo was one, and they were subjected to police repression, police surveillance and repression. and the USAID Office of Public Safety was beefing up the Venezuelan police and importing modern surveillance technologies, walkie-talkies, helping to coordinate blacklists of the leftists. And a lot were ultimately tortured, rounded up and tortured in a very repressive campaign. And Betancourt, the population ultimately turned against him because of his repressive techniques. So that kind of epitomizes, American foreign policy in a nutshell. During the Cold War year, and especially under more, liberal leaders, it was kind of a facade that they were promoting more humane governing structure because they were supporting, these kind of mild leftists who would but go after the real left. And that, sets the groundwork for what occurred. There's a lot of continuity in U.S. foreign policy across administrations. And then when Chavez finally, they had years of bad government after the 60s in Venezuela, and the continued problem of foreign control over their oil, which was a great potential source of wealth for the country. And that's when, Chavez came in and nationalized the oil. And even the New York Times admitted, which is, heavily partisan, is basically an organ of the U.S. Democratic Party and, pro-capitalist newspaper. But they admitted in reports that, and these may have been drawn from the World Bank, that, poverty rates, especially extreme poverty, was cut by something like 60%. And the use of the oil revenue made, was used for positive effect, with many social programs, and the economy improved considerably, especially the poor. And they provide a strong base. The Socialist governing party has a huge base of political support, and that continues up to the present day. Though the U.S. strategy, has been to try and impose these draconian sanctions to ruin Venezuela's economy, to get the population to turn against the socialist government. And it's the same strategy that was used in Chile in the early 70s, when you had Salvador Allende came in, and Democrat, and Allende was pretty similar to Chavez and Maduro, because, the Jimmy Carter Center, don't forget, went to scrutinize the Venezuelan elections, and you've been there as well, and they found that was one of the best run elections in the world. So these were democratic socialist governments that, they had some affinity with the Castro regime in Cuba, but they used democratic methods. And in the case of Chile, the issue with the copper industry, and actually, in my book, Modernizing Repression, which is focused on American clandestine police training programs during the Cold War and how they're a front for the CIA. And that's how I developed kind of expertise in the CIA, studying that in depth. And the USAID records were declassified since those programs were run out of the USAID, even though it was a CIA front, because most of the CIA documents remain classified. It's very difficult to study even past agency operations, let alone to try and understand what they're doing today. But because it was run through USAID, the record was declassified, and I spent months studying at the National Archive. And yeah, they had run those programs in Chile to try and support the center left. Again, like in the 60s, when a lot of the records are available, their strategy was not to support the far right militarists, but to try and support center left, like Christian Democrats, which they had done in Italy as well, as a centrist party, to counter the left. What they didn't want was these democratic socialist governments that would set a very good example, because they're very humane governments. There was no political repression, and they were enacting social reform that were greatly beneficial to their country, and they were uplifting the poor by placing their natural resource. In the case of Chile, it was copper, had been owned by Anaconda, copper giant, and Kennecott, two major American companies, and Allende placed it under national control and was using the resources to improve Chile's economy, develop its infrastructure, fund social programs, education, and that was widely popular and successful. So I think, it had to be destroyed, because that would ruin corporate interests around the world for America if that model spread. And so they carried out a fascist coup in Chile. And Venezuela, we've seen at least a decade of covert operations, and these brutal sanctions have been imposed. Because Kissinger famously said, with regard to Chile, make their economy scream, and they imposed sanctions, embargoes. They encouraged, in the Chilean case, they encouraged strikes. They paid off like truckers to carry off strikes to try and destabilize the economy and destabilize the government. And they've been using all kind of dirty tricks in Venezuela. If you want, we can discuss the coup. We know some details about a 2020 coup attempt involving mercenaries from Florida, led by a guy named Jordan Goudreau. We can discuss if you want.
Sure, let's talk about that. We got a couple of coups to talk about, but let's start at the latest and go back with the next of the latest. But let's start in 2020 and go backwards.
Okay, yeah, and that coup, we have some details on that came out, and it's been reported in numerous newspapers. And I just saw an interview, I think this week, Max Blumenthal, the Gray Zone, actually interviewed Goudreau, and he was pretty frank about what he was doing there. And yeah, it was basically a coup they were trying to mount out of Colombia, using mercenaries led by this guy Goudreau, who had been an ex-special forces officer, and he was working for a mercenary company. And he was allied with one because the first Trump administration was trying to promote as an alternative to Maduro this guy named Juan Guaido, who was a protege of Leopoldo Lopez, who was one of the instigators of the 2014 insurrection in Venezuela against the Maduro government that was very violent. And he had to flee because he was charged with terrorist crimes, and he had to flee to Spain. And he was, the National Endowment for Democracy claimed he was a prisoner of conscience when he had triggered a violent uprising. And he was a far right. He came from an aristocratic lineage. And there's a class dimension, the comprador class and the elite 1%, they're often tied with the interests of U.S. corporations and U.S. imperialism. And they made, huge profits historically while keeping their population down. So he's of that class, and I believe he was involved in supporting the 2002 coup against Chavez. So he was Guaido was Lopez's protege, and he was the front man for the coup operation. And I think at one point Trump even anointed him leader of Venezuela, even though he had no official position in government in Venezuela and very limited support. And his main policy he was promoting was privatizing the oil industry, which is of the interests of U.S. corporations, the U.S. oil industry, and perhaps the U.S. government. So that coup operation failed, but Goudreau, I think he feel that he was scapegoated when he was getting orders from the top, and it was sanctioned by the Trump administration, and then they kind of blamed him as this rogue mercenary element, but really he was an instrument of much larger policy.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think it was kind of Keystone Cops. They called it the Bay of Piglets, and it didn't go anywhere. And I know Guaido stole a lot of money. Like, he was a very unsavory character, and there was a lot of theft of monies, and it was not a competently run operation. And then they put Guaido, they gave him a position at the Florida International University. You see how corrupt academia is. I mean, this guy has no academic credentials. I don't even think he had a college degree in engineering, I believe, because I did an article on that. I've done a series on the corruption of higher education in the United States, and it's cooptation by the State Department and CIA. And I mean, that's an insult to everybody who studies for a PhD and puts in the work, the arduous years of work that it takes to get a PhD, to get the credentials to teach at a college. And then you have this basically a political gangster with no credentials, and they're appointing him to teach students when he has no qualification, and he's on the wrong side of history as well. So that is just an absolute outrage. But that's the corruption we see around us.
Well, you've got Hillary Clinton teaching at Columbia, Victoria Nuland teaching, and I happen to know that it's called the Johns Hopkins School of International Studies. I don't know if you're familiar with it, right?
Oh, yes.
All of the nastiest, rottenest, blood-soaked neocons all either teach there or come out of there. It is clearly a neocon operation think tank of the worst level. And when you go to Stanford and see the whatever that Stanford Center is, you go to the whatever the Kennedy School in Harvard, what you find is that these think tanks that are oftentimes named after presidents or famous political figures are the most rabid warmongering, pro-war, pro-imperial regime change machines on earth.
Yes, and the John Hopkins, actually, I have an article I've been working on that may come out next year, an investigation into John Hopkins and the use of that university as a cover for covert operations. And the president of John Hopkins, I think at one point, the names I have in my article, I can't remember all the names, but one of their presidents had been on the National Intelligence Board, and they're top figures in the CIA affiliated with the John Hopkins School of Medicine. Yeah, I was working with an Australian who was a target of a covert operation to steal his, because he had a computer software company that the CIA valued, and they were using, and he was entering in a partnership with some people at the John Hopkins Medical School, but they double crossed him, and it was a covert operation run out of that school. And I also found in the research I've done that MIT was used for covert operation in Ukraine, that they were using students who are skilled in science to develop a better logistics network for monitoring all the weapons going to the front lines and systemizing it over computers and using these kind of brainiacs from MIT. And at MIT, it wasn't, because I was doing some research on MIT, and it was actually in their newsletter. I was reading some newsletters, and they put it out as like a public interest story, like a feel-good story, that these MIT students, and it highlighted that a number of them had military backgrounds, and that they were doing this project for the Ukrainian government, and they're basically outing a covert operation using the cover of MIT. And their Russian specialist was heavily involved, like said a Ukraine club, and she was a Russian specialist, but I looked up her academic articles were just like rants against Putin and totally one-sided analysis of the Ukraine conflict, depicting Putin as like a new Hitler. And she's a distinguished professor in the history department at MIT. So this is what students are getting these days. And yeah, at Harvard, they appointed Jake Sullivan right after he left the Biden White House, and he was an arch neocon and top war hawk in the Biden administration, known especially for his anti-China positions, as well as I think a key figure in the arms spigot to coordinating that to the Israelis. And then he's one of the long list of war criminals on the faculty there, going back to Henry Kissinger. They had McGeorge Bundy, was the key architect of the Vietnam War. They had Sam Huntington, who called for bombing. He wrote a famous article that became famous in the anti-war movement, at least in the Vietnam era, that he called for bombing the countryside so they could effect an urban revolution by getting all the peasants to move to the city and somehow win them. This was like his intellectual argument. And Noam Chomsky raked him through the coals, but he was tied with the elite Trilateral Commission, which was key in bringing in Jimmy Carter and kind of co-opting the left and undermining left-wing movements in the 70s. And he was their star political science professor with long CIA ties and had been a direct advisor to the Jimmy Carter administration. And they also had Samantha Power, who's the key warmonger, who's got liberals to support war by claiming it's against genocide. And her book is a fraud. I did a review of a book, her famous book, A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide, and I exposed it as a work of scholarly fraud, which even in her first chapter praises a war propagandist in World War I and distorts the history of the Armenian conflict and with Turkey, and distorts many conflicts, including the Rwanda conflict. She presents a totally false picture of the situation there. So it's a poor academic standard, plus poor value system on the poor students who are being miseducated with these kind of people, and not real people who study for years to get a PhD and do real scholarly investigation. They can't get jobs in this job market. It's all adjunct work, which is basically paid the wage of McDonald's level workers after working for years of a PhD. And there's so many highly qualified and talented investigators and researchers and teachers who can't get jobs. And instead, these people, that is a real crime, I think. And this, I hope more people will try and push back against what's been going on, which precedes Trump. Trump has brought a lot of attention with his attacks on academia. So I'm glad there's some pushback against Trump, but it's a much broader phenomena.
I know someone who was going for working on a postgraduate degree at Georgetown about 7 years ago, when Assange was arrested and jailed, and they wrote an article on that. And for their class, they had to do, a research paper or whatever, and they wrote it on that. And they said, basically, the professor was unhappy. And how they let people present their papers in class? That was not presented in class. And they just gave him a B, wouldn't discuss it, wouldn't let him present it, anything, just said, okay, here's a B, just leave me alone.
So that's a violation of academic standard of freedom. And, I've taught in colleges for many years, and, I don't always agree with the students, but they have a right to express their view, and they also have a right to a fair grade. If they do good research and they make an argument and they present evidence, even if it's something I don't agree with, if they've done their research and presented it well, they deserve a fair grade. A, or whatever the fair grade is. And yeah, I met a student from Wellesley who did an article with Covert Action, and she had a similar experience at her school because she was into the 9/11 stuff, and she really did, and she wrote a great article for Covert Action that was based on some research and papers she had done as a student at Wellesley. And one of her teachers, basically practically censored her, barred her from the class discussion list, and I think she had to drop his class. So that is a violation of standards of academic freedom and the code of professors, and that is a disgrace. Again, I've been in academia for a long time, and I always give students the leeway to pursue their own research and ideas.
Speaking of what the other thing we were discussing, and that is, or rather, what's colleges being involved in covert operations. Here's an article I'm familiar with. Johns Hopkins University, now this is since over, but this was back in 2015, sued by 750 plaintiffs seeking $1 billion in compensation for its alleged role in U.S. government experiments during the 40s and 50s that deliberately infected subjects in Guatemala with venereal diseases. The suit claims Hopkins officials had substantial influence over the studies, controlling advisory panels, were involved in planning and authorized the experiment. So in court, in particular, court documents say that a Johns Hopkins doctor chaired the National Research Council Committee that approved the proposed study and secured federal funding for it. 3 other members of the panel also had ties to the university. So my point is, they have been in there. Well, at the same time, how do we know? At the same time they were doing this, they were doing the Tuskegee experiments to poor Black folks in the United States. Now, these were poor people, peasants in Guatemala who, couldn't read or write, and they were living in small villages, infecting people. And Johns Hopkins didn't hesitate. So, and the fact that Johns Hopkins officials were chairing a government board to do this shows that for many years, there's been no real delineation, particularly, and this was a intelligence related operation. There's been no real line between certain parts of academia and intelligence and the government.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a long pattern of this. One thing that's coming out more now with the release of documents is the MK Ultra and how universities were used for those psychological experiments, including involving drugs. And I think there was a huge operation at Harvard where there was basically unethical experiments with drugs were carried out on students. And ultimately, Timothy Leary got renowned for that, but he was part of and fired, but he was actually part of a much larger operation, and it was sanctioned by top department heads, and others were doing the kind of stuff he was doing, and it was all part of a CIA operation, the MK Ultra, to see how people's minds can be manipulated, and they thought LSD could be this magic drug that they could use in the battlefield and interrogation and stuff to get prisoners of war to to talk and or to open up certain pathways of the brain, and they were experimenting unethically on students. So this has, and there's the infamous situation at my alma mater, McGill University in Canada, involving Ewan Cameron, who was a key figure in the Operation MK Ultra, was doing kind of sadistic experiments out of McGill University in Canada, and Donald O'Hebb was another of his proteges. So that's just one more example of how they're using universities to conduct nefarious experiments for the CIA. And then, these foreign policy schools, if you look into it, like at Johns Hopkins, Advanced School of International Study, the Princeton, these were targets of protest during the Vietnam era, because the students discovered they were doing all kinds of weapons-related and intelligence-related projects that in that era were contributing to the atrocities in the Vietnam War. So they became legitimate targets of student protest. And I think we need more of that. The Gaza encampment movement, I think, was a start. They were starting to probe how a lot of their schools were complicit with the Israeli atrocities. Now I think they need to probe more deeply into not just Israel, but more broadly with American imperialism across the globe, how their campus is complicit and how certain research institutes are involved with that. And they should issue a report, because some reports were issued, like MIT students issued a report on their campus's complicity in the Israeli atrocities, and how some of the scientists at MIT were involved in developing drones for the Israeli military. But that's not a unique program. Like, that's going on all around the country. I was doing a project with a student trying to help him about drone development at Oklahoma State University, the state I live. And so this is pervasive everywhere, and it's not just related to the Israel conflict. So it'd be great if more students pursued more investigations, issued more reports, and denounced or protested those professors who are complicit in unethical intelligence operations or war crimes.
Yeah, I think you're right. I agree with that, definitely. Let's look back, because one of the things we want to get back to is this issue. Let me find it, of the relationship, and I think we need to discuss that some. The relationship between the um, the immigration issues on the southern border and the US's moves to destabilize these regions, and we end up just facing basically the consequences of our actions. You destabilize a country, the people are impoverished, they're hungry, they're starving. One of the things, and I know you're familiar with it, is NAFTA. I read that NAFTA destabilized small Mexican farmers, and like 1.4 million or something like that, small Mexican farmers lost their farms, lost everything. The price was drive down. They couldn't survive. And then that's when you had like 1 million Mexicans showing up at the border because of the U.S. trade policies.
Yeah, I read a lot about that too when I was researching the Clinton, my book for Bill Clinton and his administration. I read articles on NAFTA, and I'd read a bit about it before, and that's what a lot of articles emphasize, that it opened by limiting tariffs and pushing free trade. It undercut Mexican farmers who couldn't compete with big U.S. agribusiness, who were basically subsidized. And Clinton admitted this, that, I think he admitted things like with regard to Haiti as well, that he said, oh, it was good for my Arkansas rice farmers, but it devastated Haiti's economy because a small farmer can't compete with the big agribusiness who can produce things en masse and sell it for a lower price. So, and if you reduce any tariff subsidies, so it makes sense. And that also fueled the growth of the drug trade, because you have People who can't make a living in their traditional agricultural practices, they're forced to migrate to cities. They don't have the educational level to get good paying jobs. They're forced often into sweatshop environments, and they can't even make a living. And youth, with the commercial culture that's around, they want to drive a fancy car. And the only way they can get that is by joining the drug cartels and the drug trade. And it was shown to fuel the huge boom in the drug trade from Mexico. So what kind of policy is that, really?
So let me ask you this about your article, and that is, the Darien Gap straddling Panama and Colombia is a mass migrant graveyard that exemplifies injustice of today's global economy. MAGA warnings of an enemy invasion through the gap helps justify cruel policies targeting vulnerable people who have been victimized by U.S. foreign policy. And see, there's the key right there. And that is, the United States creates a fire, is an arsonist and claims to be the fireman. The United States creates some horrific situation where the people are struggling, the people can't survive, they're desperate, they're wandering all over the place trying to find a place to get any kind of way. There's no work, there's no anything. And then the U.S. says, these people, remember Kamala Harris, after, the El Mozote massacre and all of the things we've done in Guatemala, she goes to Guatemala and just says to them, just don't come. Just that easy. Just stay here. Don't come here. It's with a total disregarding of all of the horrible slayings and government overthrows that the United States has done in regime change operations in Guatemala. Your thoughts?
Absolutely, yeah. And this book, is a great book by Belen Fernandez, who it's a review of her book with Rutgers University Press, and she's an intrepid journalist who wanted to undertake this perilous mission for herself to see what these immigrants go through, these migrants, and hell, most of us, we live comfortable lives where we can enjoy ourselves. We have the necessities. We can pursue recreation in our free time, and these people have to live like animals just to try and find a way of feeding their family and trek through the jungle. So she went on the mission, and they're dealing with the elements, with snakes, wild animals, then there are predatory elements. I mean, a lot of women and girls have been raped on this trek. There, predatory elements will take advantage of the situation. All kinds of hazards they have to deal with, and it's really physically arduous trek. So there should be more empathy for what these people go through and how lucky we have it. They're being demonized, and then there's the point you say that a lot of the reason they're moving is because either the injustice of the global economy or the U.S. has been involved in foreign policy intervention that destabilized and helped wreck economy in countries like Guatemala and El Salvador. I mean, they went through traumatic civil wars in the 80s with horrific violence, and the U.S. was a key instigator of those wars, and they never recovered from those conflicts. And El Salvador developed huge gang problem because the entire social fabric was destroyed in the 80s conflict, and you had all these weapons. And and then in the 90s, the Clinton and George W. Bush administration imposed CAFTA on Central American countries, which was a variant of NAFTA, and the same kind of problem we're describing in Mexico occurred in those countries. It harmed their agriculture, their farming industry irrevocably, and put a lot of small farmers out of business. So what are people going to do? And actually, I remember because I went to some meetings at one point with the group Committee in Solidarity, CISPAS, which it was formed in the 80s. It was like an offshoot of Fair Play for Cuba, that the U.S. should not intervene at all in El Salvador. And they were still active in the 2000s in the Boston area, which I was living. They had a lot of Salvadorans, and I went to some meetings. And Noam Chomsky once gave a speech with the group that was great. And anyway, I remember one of the meetings was about CAFTA, and it was good. I learned a lot. And they said, I remember a Salvadorian spoke, and he said at that time the leader was a guy named Tony, I think, Sackus, who was this neoliberal right-wing leader, was close to Bush. And he's like, this guy admitted, he said, oh, El Salvadorans survived the 80s Civil War, they'll survive Hurricane CAFTA. And like he knew, the Salvadoran leader knew he was screwing over his own people with those policies, and that was going to have a very harsh effect on the population. So is it any wonder, as you say, that Salvadoran have to escape? I mean, the American dollar is mighty, and the other thing is their families are struggling. If they come to the United States, given the injustice of the global economy, the American dollar has so much more value. So a key reason they come here is to try and work for 5 or 10 years so they can send money back to their family and live at a basic level or more decent level. So, I mean, it's rational human behavior. So why are we demonizing these people and mistreating them? And then, yeah, there's no critical reflection, in the public and debate about, I mean, how we can address the root of this problem. If people are up in arms about immigration, and it should be noted, this book emphasizes that immigrants actually benefit the U.S. economy because the U.S. population is aging, and there are actually not enough young people to fill all the jobs, and immigrants fill them. So she makes the point that it's actually good for the economy, for the U.S. economy. And she cites numerous economic reports. So as much as they're blamed for social problems, a lot of economists and evidence would indicate that those immigrants actually benefit the U.S. economy will benefit in the future, particularly with the aging of the population. So there's that you don't hear about much. And then, yeah, there's no willingness, if you're so alarmed about immigrants flood, the term they use like on the right and the left sometimes just goes along with that narrative. Immigrants are flooding, or it's a foreign invasion of immigrants. You hear that kind of language. But again, if you are worried about that, yeah, why not address the root of the problem? U.S. foreign policy, U.S. trade policy, and justice of the global economy, and develop solutions for that. Fair economic standards, so that they wouldn't have to seek to flee their country to come here. And the sanctions on Venezuela is a key case in point. That's been deliberately designed to wreck their economy, and it's fueled the mass migration of Venezuelans rationally because they cannot make a living. It's an economic war on their country, and it's designed to get them to blame their government, which some do. But whatever the case, there's the numbers show huge Venezuelan migration patterns. So and Gustavo Petro, the Colombian president, he sensibly said, well, if you're worried about immigration, stop the sanctions on Venezuela, stop it on Nicaragua, stop it on Cuba, because those are very harsh sanctions that have affected those countries adversely, which are socialist governments that want to put assert national control over their own economic resources, and are adopting more nationalistic economic policies, or tied a little more with China. Like I know Nicaragua has made some economic deal with China that they perceive as beneficial to their economy. But the U.S. doesn't want China gaining more influence, so that they have to ratchet up the sanctions, and that hurts the Nicaraguan economy. So Nicaragua more are coming to the United States, and then they're angry that they're coming here. It makes no sense. But when Petra said that, they just ignored him or ridiculed him. Now Trump has been ridiculing Petro when he's a very sensible guy and an intelligent leader of Colombia.
Well, what's interesting is you discussing in our discussion earlier, you mentioned that previously the Venezuela was extremely poor, and the United States, the actual Standard Oil Company, the Rockefeller Company, controlled and pumped all the oil out of Venezuela and kept all the money, and the Venezuelans didn't get any of it. And when the Venezuelans revolted and said, okay, we want our own, now the U.S. says, your leader's an evil, terrible dictator who must be stopped, and we're stepping in to help the people. So the government that says we want to sell the oil and use that money to help the people, U.S. says those are evil dictators. The government that says we want to allow the Rockefeller Corporation to sell all the oil and keep all the money for the United States, which, might I add, goes into the hands of the ruling elite. The American people, even though the Rockefeller Standard Oil was stealing the oil, they were keeping the money. The United States people didn't even share into the loot of that piracy. They just kept it. So even our only job is when they need somebody to go fight and die in the war, like now, they want that oil. Now, they may need some people to go die. Well, those are working class, good old boys from Georgia and all over the place, poor people, the sons of poor people, and who went in the military many times because, you know, they were from small towns, didn't have a lot of money. I have known people that went in the military because they didn't have a lot of economic options, right? So now it's time to steal the oil, time to steal oil again. Well, we'll just send those boys. We ain't going to send the boys of the rich. You know what I mean? The wealthy, we ain't sending their boys. So now what happens to me is what you see is the poor get to send their kids in and die to steal the oil and the resources of Venezuela so that the rich can then, ExxonMobil, et cetera, can then go and steal all the oil. And those people who died won't even get anything. They'll end up homeless veterans on the street because they can't do anything to help homeless veterans.
Absolutely, yeah. And 2 points, yeah. And the first related to the point about dictator, you know, they call Venezuela a dictator. Well, one of the most oppressive leaders in South America today is the Salvadoran leader. You know, and this came out with the immigration issue when Trump was kidnapping people, or these alleged gang leaders, and taking them to this horrific prison in El Salvador. And all of a sudden, there were a lot of media reports shedding light on the abhorrent human rights situation in El Salvador, which I had been monitoring because, it continued to fall. The CISPAS had issued reports going back a few years about this leader. What's his name again? The Salvadoran leader, Bukele, Nayib Bukele.
Yeah, Bukele, right.
And actually, the Massachusetts Congressman Jim McGovern stated publicly about 3-4 years ago that the abuses going on in El Salvador were much worse than in the 80s. And McGovern had been one of the key officials who was in Congress for a long time, who had stood against the Reagan policy in Central America and was an expert about the atrocities, you know, and had taken a very principled stand against the U.S. foreign policy of that era. So he was intimately familiar with that. And so for him to say it's much worse under Bukele is a very strong statement about how horrific things are there. And they're rounding up anybody. You know, he claims he's cleaning up the country by fighting the gangs. And anybody who has any relative in a gang or suspected is being, basically a lot of young people, if they're born in the wrong part of the city, they're being rounded up as teenagers and thrown into this horrific prison where they're locked in a room and it's totally inhumane. They only get 30 minutes out of their room per day, and they're locked in a room like 100 or 200 people are crowded into a tiny room for 23 and a half hours a day, and they're given no exercise. And I think they can only study the Bible for that 30 minutes. And it's not clear where they go to the bathroom, whether they're being properly nourished. And this may be like a concentration camp. And this is absolutely horrifying. And Trump said that's his favorite leader. And, you know, the right wing was fawning over this guy. So, I mean, as far as the double standard, they're accusing Venezuela of being a dictatorship. And yet they're nothing. You know, we have open, anybody can just go on the internet and find media reports about these horrific prison conditions in El Salvador and the huge roundups. And this guy has totally usurped power for himself. He's devastated all other branches of government, and they're openly saying how he's a dictator. Then there's, of course, Honduras. For years, the U.S. was supporting another narco dictator, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who's now in the U.S. prison, was given a life sentence in U.S. prison. But, you know, he was given the kid glove treatment too, whereas Venezuela. So, I mean, it's just such an egregious double standard. And then, you know, as far as human rights and these claims about dictatorship, especially considering that the Jimmy Carter said that was the best run elections, among the best in the world. And yeah, on your point about the class, yeah, it's always been like that. That the working class fight the wars in the interest of the rich. They never send their sons and or daughters. And I mean, yeah, they use mostly, they try and use proxy forces and mercenaries like this Jordan Goudreau to keep, the American public keep a distance. If middle class America doesn't have any direct stake, if their own lives. I think that's what they learned from the Vietnam War, because there was a huge protest in Vietnam. That's why they had to abolish the draft. And U.S. foreign policy ever since has resorted to more covert operation and high-tech weapon systems, or use of mercenaries or foreign proxy forces. And that's why, if you look at the wars today, I mean, basically in the Middle East, the Israelis serve as a proxy force of the United States to try and root out radical elements or any threats to American power in the Middle East. And in Eurasia, it's the Ukrainians have been used as a proxy force to directly attack Russia.
What's interesting about when you look at South America right now, they've got this woman, Maria Corina Machado, for Venezuela, and she's this so-called, she's the latest Juan Guaido. She's always, she's the Venezuelan leader, and she keeps saying the United States has to attack Venezuela and overthrow the government. Well, that ain't much of a leader. But what you see is these people, these puppets that they put in charge. But here's the interesting thing about her. She is an arch Zionist, an absolute arch Zionist. And what I find interesting is the connection wherein there is also a long history of Israelis in South America, Israelis training death squads, Israelis training police. Is the Israelis being used by the U.S. empire in South America as a proxy force.
Yes, and in the research I have done on the covert operations in the Cold War, and it should be noted it's much easier to do research on the Cold War than the present, since so much is hidden. But I found there was an Israeli operation, KK Mountain, that was, I think, sponsored by the CIA, where they used Mossad and Israeli intelligence operatives basically to do the dirty work of the U.S. empire. And it's a way to distance the public, to subcontract it out to allied countries and their intelligence service. And that's why Israel is such a valued, asset for the U.S. empire. And that's why the U.S. continues to give so much money to the Israelis, even amidst the moral outrage over what they've been doing in Gaza. So, and the KK Mountain was active in Africa. It was not just Central America. There were a lot of Mossad operations in Africa. And I think it was Mossad elements trained like Joseph Mobutu, the notorious Congolese dictator, in like parachute jumping. And they gave him direct military training. And they were involved in covert operations there. In Uganda, they helped bring in Idi Amin because there was a socialist leader, Milton Obote, who U.S. and Western corporation couldn't do business with him. And then, Central America, they were involved. That was a way to distance the dirty operation, like in Central America in the 80s, have a limited American footprint by using the Israelis to do some of the training and working with local death squads to root out the left-wing groups, because they were targeting like FMLN, the Farabundo Martí Liberation Front. That was the group that the U.S. was trying to suppress. And later they came to power, although I think they moderated their platform, but they came to power, and they were no threat to the United States. The U.S. actually had good relations with them, like in the 2000s when they were in office. I mean, they weren't any kind of national security threat to the United States. So, I mean, what was the reason behind those wars? Reagan tried to claim, the communists are 100 kilometers from our border, but I mean, FMLN wasn't even really a communist organization. So there's really, it's hard to find an actual purpose for those wars, and sadly, they devastate, as we were discussing. They had a horrific human cost for the Salvadorian and Guatemalan populations, and it's a disgrace that the Israelis were involved in that. And that's why many Jewish people, like myself, became disgusted at how the Israeli state evolved, as just the kind of doing that dirty work for the U.S. empire and involved in some of the just horrific crimes that Jews experience under Nazism. That's the level of crime we're talking about. Sadistic death squad killers that they're arming, and outright fascists like Roberto Dubuisson, was a key death squad leader that I think may have worked with the Israelis and CIA. He murdered the Archbishop Oscar Romero, who was like a Martin Luther King type figure, and was just a pro-fascist guy. So it's awful.
I remember during the, I think, 80s and 90s, when every time you turned around in South America, because there was an element of Catholicism that believed in, raising the poor and all that kind of stuff. And the U.S. was going around, well, the U.S.'s proxy death squads were going around South America. They've done it in Venezuela too, shooting and killing these Catholic priests that pushed that, and killing and raping nuns.
Yeah.
And every time you turned around. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to add, even American nuns got raped and killed by these animals.
Yeah, so the U.S. has been involved in a lot of dirty work, and I'll say this to the MAGA people. They're like, oh, yeah, we got to go into Venezuela. You don't want to do that. And I just keep saying, I've been there. They don't want to do that. You don't. If they go into Venezuela, it is going to be, I don't know what they can do. They can throw tomahawks at Venezuela from a distance. If they go in Venezuela, those people will fight them, and they're armed. And geez, American soldiers outnumbered 100 to 1 in the jungles of Venezuela. That's no way to have to fight a war. It would be massive. It would be very, very bad news. And of course, as we're discussing, that would not only be Venezuelans showing up at the border, but if you think about it, if there is a mass movement of, let's say, Venezuela's fleeing the war, and that war can easily spread out to Colombia. There's regions in Guyana with the oil, that the U.S. are interested in getting oil on Venezuela's border. Before you know it, it's spread out. That war spreads, and millions are showing up at the border. But if you're in El Salvador, if you're in Guatemala, if you're in another country, and you want to come to the U.S., and you've already started a massive influx of people to the border, well, everybody in the region who wants to come is going to join, because now it gets difficult. You think they're having problems now. What happens if 2-3 million people at the border? They'll just flood anything and keep coming. There's no way to stop them. It will be a disaster of biblical proportions for our border. So the MAGA people that out there that think, oh yeah, it's a great idea, let's overthrow or attack a country and start a war with a country that is full of mountains and jungles and 30 million people and the size of France and Germany combined, thinking that that's a good idea, they'll finally get a wake-up call that they won't be able to fix.
Absolutely, yeah. It sounds what you're describing. It'll be another Vietnam catastrophe, and they're underestimating how the Venezuelan will fight for their sovereignty as a country, and that the Bolivarian revolution means a lot to the Venezuelan people. And even though there may be some problem with the government, which is true of all governments, at the core, the Bolivarian Revolution was about reclaiming their sovereignty as a nation, taking control over their natural resources, and standing up to Western imperialism and American neocolonialism. And Chavez invoked the symbol of Simon Bolivar, who was the great liberator of Latin America. And Venezuela has played a symbolic role in encouraging other Latin American nations to assert more of their independence, like Bolivia. Evo Morales and Nicaragua, and they're trying to form regional alliances to strengthen the continent overall, and that's a project that many Latin Americans support. So I think the MAGA and others who may be supporting aggressive action don't understand the history of Venezuela and South America, the history of U.S. imperialism there, and that's why studying history is so important, because it could prevent catastrophe. As you're saying, this has all the makings of another Vietnam type catastrophe, another Bay of Pigs. I mean, Castro was able to mobilize the Cubans, and there's no reason to think that Maduro couldn't do the same. So it's going to backfire for the United States as well, and just cost a lot of lives. And as you say, it'll open the floodgates of more immigration. I mean, look, and refugees. I mean, look at the Syria conflict. People are so in the government up in arms about immigrants and refugees, and yet they trigger these regime change operations and war, so that caused floods of refugees. I mean, Syria and Libya caused floods of refugees into Europe, and then you have a similar thing where the Europeans are all aghast that these people are going to taint their society. Well, what about the foreign policies of your governments that started wars, started regime, destabilization operations, and brought in Al Qaeda? I mean, in both Syria and Libya, Western intervention resulted in the empowerment of Al Qaeda, Islamic extremists, who carried out atrocities and forced more refugees through their draconian and sectarian ethnic cleansing policies. So, yeah, it makes no sense. An upside down world. And unfortunately, a lot of people are miseducated. The media inflames them. These right-wing demagogues, rant against immigrants, and people are just not are buy into it. They don't have enough education on political issues. That's why I always feel education is very important.
Absolutely. The U.S. has put itself in a bad position. And here's the other thing. Let's say they get bogged down in that war. So now they're bogged down in Ukraine. Oh, by the way, millions of Ukrainian refugees have shown up on their doorsteps all over Europe. And they were like, oh, yay, Ukrainian refugees. We must welcome them right away. And now they're like, oh, crap. How are we going to keep giving money to the Ukrainian refugees as things are falling apart? And because they won't make any kind of a deal in Ukraine, when Ukraine finally falls apart, this winter, they're talking about very cold temperatures and not having electricity and all that. Millions of people are going to leave. They're going to be heading to Western Europe. And so the ruling elite create these wars, and the people suffer from the floods of refugees, and the refugees suffer, and everybody suffers. And then the ruling elite says we must demonize the refugees. Otherwise, people will realize it's all our fault. At any rate, let's once again we're looking at Covert Action magazine, exposing covert action since 1978. Whatever you want to know about CIA operations, how about this 9/11, Biden series, Israel, Gaza, political assassinations, war in Ukraine, all these great series that you can learn a lot about. Tell everybody about Covert Action magazine. What do they need to know about it, Jeremy?
Sure. Well, that was a magazine founded by CIA whistleblower Philip Agee. Yeah, and he would be horrified by what's going on now in South America and with the threats of war on Venezuela, because he worked for around a decade in South America, and he came to see the injustice of U.S. foreign policy, that they were aligning with reactionary groups and carrying out a lot of illegal activity to compromise the sovereignty and undermine democracy in South American countries. So his book, Inside the Company, a CIA Diary, is well worth reading even today. And he founded the Covert Action magazine to continue to promote critical thinking on U.S. foreign policy and expose covert operations.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. Everyone, make sure you go to covertactionmagazine.com and you can, subscribe and get an account there and keep up with all their stuff and be notified. It's well worth it if you want to learn everything that's out there about everything from 9/11 to the Ukraine conflict to historical CIA, MI6, all of those covert operations. This is the place to go. Outstanding website. I recommend it to everyone. And Dr. Kuzmarov, this is one of my favorite shows of the week, so I really enjoyed it. I want to thank you. Everybody, thanks to my Patreon people. You can become a Patreon member if you can afford it. Patreon, PayPal, buy me a coffee, Cash App, any of that stuff is highly appreciated. If you can help support the channel. I do have a PO box for those who want to send whatever you want to send to the my PO box snail mail. Feel free to do that. Thank you very much. We are out.